December 19, 1941. Imperial Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Vice Admiral Kentaro Shimazaki couldn't suppress the satisfied smile spreading across his weathered face as he reviewed the intelligence reports spread across the mahogany conference table. Through the frost-etched windows of the Naval Ministry, Tokyo's winter morning cast pale light across documents that confirmed what every senior officer in the room already believed. America's industrial capacity, while impressive on paper, could never match the focused efficiency of Japanese naval construction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Their carrier fleet is crippled, Shimazaki announced to the assembled staff officers, his finger tracing the list of American vessels. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, 3 operational carriers against our 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. The mathematics favor us decisively. What Shimazaki didn't know, what none of the confident officers nodding in agreement around that table could have possibly imagined, was that they were staring at the opening page of their own empire's obituary. Within 18 months, the industrial colossus they had dismissed would unleash a production miracle so overwhelming, so impossibly vast, that Japanese shipyards would seem like artisan workshops by comparison. The Americans weren't just going to build carriers, they were going to manufacture them like automobiles, turning them out faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from their decks. The laughter in that Tokyo conference room would transform into horrified disbelief as American shipyards rewrote every assumption about naval construction. But in December 1941, as Shimazaki closed the intelligence folder with confident finality, the Imperial Navy had no idea they had just poked an industrial dragon that would bury them under an avalanche of steel.
Rear Admiral Takeshi Morimoto, Chief of Naval Intelligence, had spent 3 years studying American industrial capacity. His December 1941 assessment to the Naval General Staff was delivered with the confidence of a man who had done his homework. The Americans possess significant manufacturing capability, Morimoto acknowledged, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he addressed Fleet Admiral Hideaki Yamada and the senior command staff. However, naval construction requires specialized facilities, trained workers, and, most critically, time. Their civilian economy, automobiles, refrigerators, consumer goods, cannot simply transform into warship production. The expertise required to build a carrier takes decades to develop. Morimoto's analysis seemed reasonable, even conservative. Japanese naval architects had refined carrier design through years of practical experience. The Kaga, Akagi, and Shokaku represented the pinnacle of naval engineering, each vessel a masterpiece of careful craftsmanship, requiring 2 to 3 years of construction by specialized workers whose skills had been honed across generations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our latest intelligence indicates the Americans have laid down keels for 3 Essex-class carriers, Morimoto continued, pointing to reconnaissance photographs. Based on their historical construction timelines, we can expect these vessels to enter service in late 1943 or early 1944. We will have commissioned 4 additional carriers by then, maintaining our numerical advantage. What the Japanese intelligence apparatus completely failed to grasp was that America wasn't planning to build carriers the Japanese way. They were going to build them the American way, with mass production techniques, prefabrication, parallel construction, and an industrial workforce that would grow from thousands to hundreds of thousands practically overnight. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, sitting at the far end of the conference table, raised a cautious objection. What if the Americans apply their automotive production methods to shipbuilding? Ford produces 1 car every 60 seconds. Shimazaki's dismissive laugh echoed through the room. A carrier is not an automobile, Nakamura-san. You cannot stamp out a flight deck like a car hood. The Americans are wealthy, yes, but wealth without expertise is merely expensive incompetence.
What the Japanese failed to understand was already taking shape 3,000 miles east of Tokyo, in places they had never heard of and would never bomb. Henry Morrison stood in the frozen mud of what had been a Rhode Island cornfield 6 months earlier, watching bulldozers carve enormous rectangles into the earth. The December wind cut through his coat, but Morrison, freshly appointed director of the Patriot Bay Naval Shipyard, barely noticed. He was too busy calculating. 12 building ways, he said to his construction chief, Robert Chen, pointing at the massive excavations. 4 dedicated to escort carriers, 8 for fleet carriers. We'll have the first keels laid by March. Chen, a bridge engineer who had built half of San Francisco's highway system, studied the blueprints with a critical eye. The Navy wants the first carrier completed in 18 months. That's impossible by traditional standards. Then we don't use traditional standards, Morrison replied. We're going to build these ships the way Henry Kaiser builds Liberty ships. Prefabrication, modular construction, parallel assembly. We'll have sections built in 15 different facilities across 3 states and bring them here for final assembly. This conversation was being repeated at 6 other locations across America. The massive Crater Lake Shipyard in Oregon, the enormous Pacific Basin facility in Washington, the sprawling Atlantic Works in Virginia. Each represented an industrial investment that exceeded Japan's entire naval construction budget. But the real revolution wasn't the shipyards, it was the workers. Martha Hendricks had worked at a textile mill in Pennsylvania until August 1941. By January 1942, she was training as a welder at Patriot Bay, learning to join steel plates with precision that would have taken years to master in peacetime. She was one of 40,000 women who would work at the facility by 1943, performing jobs that Japanese naval architects insisted only men with decades of experience could handle. They told us we were building the flight deck for Carrier Hull 201, Martha recalled in a 1987 interview. None of us had ever seen a ship before, but the engineers had broken everything down into steps so clear, so systematic, that you could learn in weeks what used to take years. Everything was pre-measured, pre-cut, pre-fitted. We weren't craftsmen, we were assemblers, but we assembled with precision measured in thousandths of an inch. The scale of American mobilization defied comprehension. Bethlehem Steel increased production capacity by 400% in 6 months. Alcoa doubled aluminum output every 4 months. The Kaiser shipyards, which didn't exist in 1940, employed 200,000 workers by 1943. The initial indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong with Japanese assumptions came on April 15, 1942, when reconnaissance photographs from a long-range patrol bomber showed activity at American West Coast shipyards that made no sense. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Watanabe, photo interpretation officer at Naval Intelligence, studied the images with growing confusion. The Crater Lake facility showed not 3 construction sites, as expected, but 17 massive building ways, all with active construction. This must be an error, Watanabe told his superior, Commander Yoshiro Tanaka. Perhaps they are building merchant vessels in these additional facilities. But when subsequent reconnaissance flights, increasingly rare as American air defenses strengthened, confirmed the images, Japanese intelligence faced an uncomfortable reality. The Americans were building something on a scale that their models hadn't predicted. Admiral Morimoto's revised assessment in May 1942 attempted to rationalize the data. The Americans are constructing numerous vessels simultaneously, but this actually works against them. Quality will suffer, construction time will extend as they discover errors. Coordination across so many projects will create bottlenecks. We estimate these vessels will require 3 to 4 years to complete. This analysis made sense to officers trained in traditional naval construction. In Japanese shipyards, a carrier proceeded through carefully orchestrated stages: keel laying, hull construction,
machinery installation, superstructure assembly, fitting out. Each phase required the previous phase to be completely finished. The idea of parallel construction, installing engines while the flight deck was still being built, testing systems before the superstructure was complete, seemed like chaos. What they didn't understand was that chaos was the point. Richard Patterson, production manager at Patriot Bay, explained the philosophy to a skeptical Navy inspector in June 1942. "You're thinking like a craftsman. We're thinking like Ford." Every section of this carrier is being built simultaneously in different locations. The engine room is being assembled in Connecticut. The flight deck sections are being fabricated in Ohio. The superstructure is being built right here. When they arrive, they'll slot together like Lego blocks because every measurement, every connection point, every system has been standardized. The inspector shook his head. "Ships don't work that way." "They do now," Patterson replied.
The moment that would change everything happened on September 24, 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Shimazaki received the intelligence report at his office overlooking Tokyo Bay. He read it twice, certain there had been a translation error. Then he called for Morimoto. "This report claims the Americans have launched a fleet carrier at Patriot Bay," Shimazaki said, his voice tight with controlled disbelief. "A vessel they laid down only 14 months ago." Morimoto studied the reconnaissance photographs, the confirmation from multiple intelligence sources, the technical specifications. His hands began to shake slightly. "It appears to be accurate, Admiral. The vessel designated USS Franklin by the Americans, hull number CV-201 in their construction program, was launched last week. She is currently undergoing fitting out and sea trials." 14 months, Shimazaki repeated softly. "We estimated 28 to 36 months minimum for a fleet carrier." "The vessel may be incomplete," Morimoto offered desperately. "Perhaps they launched prematurely for propaganda purposes." But further intelligence over the following weeks painted an even more disturbing picture. The Franklin wasn't incomplete. She was approximately 80% finished at launch, far more advanced than any Japanese carrier at the same stage. More horrifyingly, 6 more carriers at various American shipyards showed similar accelerated progress. Chief Naval Architect Commander Ichiro Suzuki was brought in to analyze the construction photographs. His assessment, delivered in October 1942, marked the moment Japanese confidence began its terminal decline. "They have revolutionized naval construction," Suzuki told the stunned staff officers. "These photographs show welded construction throughout, eliminating riveting time. Prefabricated sections arrived complete with wiring, piping, and equipment already installed. The Americans are not building ships, they are assembling them from mass-produced components. This is not naval architecture as we understand it. This is industrial manufacturing applied to warships. The implications hit like a torpedo below the waterline. If they can build a carrier in 14 months, Rear Admiral Takeshi Kobayashi said slowly, and they have 17 building ways at just this one facility." Nobody wanted to complete that sentence. By November 1942, Japanese naval intelligence had assembled a picture that would have seemed like science fiction 6 months earlier. The Americans had not 3 carrier construction programs as originally estimated. They had 23 fleet and light carriers under construction simultaneously across 7 major shipyards. Additionally, they had begun a program of escort carriers, smaller, simpler vessels built on merchant ship hulls, with over 30 already launched or under construction. Morimoto's revised projections, presented to Fleet Admiral Yamada in a closed-door session, read like a funeral dirge. "Based on current American production rates, we estimate they will commission 4 fleet carriers by mid-1943, with 6 more by year's end. Escort carrier production suggests 40 to 50 vessels by the end of 1943. By 1944,
Morimoto paused, almost unable to continue. By 1944, American carrier strength could exceed 100 hulls. Impossible, Yamada said flatly. No nation can build carriers at such a rate. No nation has built carriers at such a rate, Morimoto corrected quietly. But the Americans are not building them as we do. They have transformed carrier construction into something closer to automobile manufacturing. Their workers require minimal training because the work is broken into simple, repetitive tasks. Their facilities use standardized designs, allowing them to build the same vessel simultaneously at multiple locations. Most critically, they have essentially unlimited raw materials and industrial capacity. Commander Suzuki added the technical details that made it real. A single American steel mill, the Homestead facility in Pennsylvania, produces more steel monthly than our entire national output. The Kaiser shipyards employed 15,000 workers in January 1942. They now employ 90,000. The Americans are not constrained by resources, expertise, or facilities. They are constrained only by time, and they are solving that through parallel production. The officers sat in silence, absorbing the implications. Japan's newest carrier, the Taiho, represented 3 years of their finest craftsmen's work, incorporating lessons from every previous design. The Americans were building comparable vessels in 14 months, using workers who had never seen a ship before 1942. "We have already lost the production war," Shimazaki said finally, his voice hollow. "The question is whether we have lost the actual war."
Desperate to counter American production, Japan accelerated its own construction programs. The Shinano, originally designed as a battleship, was converted to a carrier. Smaller escort carriers were authorized. Shipyards increased shifts, workers increased hours. But the mathematics were impossible. Japan possessed 6 major naval shipyards, all concentrated in the home islands, all vulnerable to future air attack. Each yard could support perhaps 2 major warship construction projects simultaneously. The workforce, while skilled, numbered in the thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Steel production, dependent on imported raw materials, was already stretched thin, supporting the Army, Navy, and Merchant Marine. Commander Hiroshi Kawasaki, assigned to analyze potential production increases, delivered his report in December 1942. To match American carrier production, we would need to increase our steel output by 500%, our aluminum production by 700%, and our workforce by 1,000%. We would need to build 4 new shipyards of major scale. The resources required would exceed our total industrial capacity. It is not difficult, it is impossible. Even more devastating was the pilot problem. Training a carrier pilot required 6 to 12 months, and that was assuming sufficient aircraft and fuel for training. Japan's pilot training program, already straining to replace combat losses, could not possibly produce enough aviators for the flood of American carriers coming online. "They will have carriers without pilots," some officers argued hopefully. But American pilot training programs dwarfed Japan's by similar proportions. In 1942, America graduated 20,000 naval aviators. Japan graduated 3,500. The reports kept coming, each one worse than the last. By early 1943, Japanese intelligence estimated American carrier strength would exceed Japan's by mid-year, with the gap widening exponentially thereafter. Admiral Shimazaki, reading the January 1943 projections in his office, realized what they were facing. The Americans hadn't just matched Japanese naval power, they were in the process of manufacturing absolute naval supremacy. "We mocked their industrial capacity," he said to Morimoto, his voice bitter. "We called them soft, undisciplined, incapable of the dedication required for naval construction. We were watching them build refrigerators in cars, and we assumed they couldn't build warships." He gestured at the intelligence reports covering his desk. "They weren't building ships in December 1941. They were building shipyards.
enormous shipyards that didn't exist 6 months ago. And now those shipyards are launching carriers while we're still cutting steel for our next vessel. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership was profound. Officers who had entered the war supremely confident in their tactical and technical superiority now faced the realization that they were fighting an opponent who could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The Americans had done something no military planner had thought possible. They had turned aircraft carriers into mass-produced commodities, and the flood had only just begun. Desperate to counter American production, Japan accelerated its own construction programs. The Shinano, originally designed as a battleship, was converted to a carrier. Smaller escort carriers were authorized. Shipyards increased shifts, workers increased hours. But the mathematics were impossible. Japan possessed 6 major naval shipyards, all concentrated in the home islands, all vulnerable to future air attack. Each yard could support perhaps 2 major warship construction projects simultaneously. The workforce, while skilled, numbered in the thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Steel production, dependent on imported raw materials, was already stretched thin, supporting the Army, Navy, and Merchant Marine. Commander Hiroshi Kawasaki, assigned to analyze potential production increases, delivered his report in December 1942. To match American carrier production, we would need to increase our steel output by 500%, our aluminum production by 700%, and our workforce by 1,000%. We would need to build 4 new shipyards of major scale. The resources required would exceed our total industrial capacity. It is not difficult, it is impossible. Even more devastating was the pilot problem. Training a carrier pilot required 6 to 12 months, and that was assuming sufficient aircraft and fuel for training. Japan's pilot training program, already straining to replace combat losses, could not possibly produce enough aviators for the flood of American carriers coming online. They will have carriers without pilots, some officers argued hopefully. But American pilot training programs dwarfed Japan's by similar proportions. In 1942, America graduated 20,000 naval aviators. Japan graduated 3,500. The reports kept coming, each one worse than the last. By early 1943, Japanese intelligence estimated American carrier strength would exceed Japan's by mid-year, with the gap widening exponentially thereafter. Admiral Shimazaki, reading the January 1943 projections in his office, realized what they were facing. The Americans hadn't just matched Japanese naval power, they were in the process of manufacturing absolute naval supremacy. "We mocked their industrial capacity," he said to Morimoto, his voice bitter. "We called them soft, undisciplined, incapable of the dedication required for naval construction. We were watching them build refrigerators in cars, and we assumed they couldn't build warships." He gestured at the intelligence reports covering his desk. They weren't building ships in December 1941. They were building shipyards, enormous shipyards that didn't exist 6 months ago. And now those shipyards are launching carriers while we're still cutting steel for our next vessel. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership was profound. Officers who had entered the war supremely confident in their tactical and technical superiority now faced the realization that they were fighting an opponent who could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The Americans had done something no military planner had thought possible. They had turned aircraft carriers into mass-produced commodities, and the flood had only just begun. March 1943. Commander Yoshiro Tanaka stood on the bridge of the light cruiser Sendai, scanning the horizon through his binoculars during a routine patrol southeast of the Marshall Islands. What he saw made him lower the glasses and blink hard, certain his eyes were deceiving him. 4 American aircraft carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft. But these weren't the pre-war carriers Japanese pilots knew, the Enterprise or the Lexington. These were new vessels, their hulls still sporting fresh paint, their identification numbers suggesting recent commissioning. "Signal to headquarters," Tanaka ordered quietly. "Multiple new American carriers confirmed operating in our patrol sector. Request identification." The response from Tokyo came hours later, and it confirmed Tanaka's worst fears. 3 of the 4 carriers had been commissioned within the previous 60 days. One of them, the USS Intrepid, had been launched just 4 months earlier. This was the moment the projections became real. The avalanche of American production wasn't theoretical anymore. It was steaming through Japanese-controlled waters with impunity. By April 1943, 6 new American fleet carriers had entered service. By July, that number reached 12. Each month brought more, their commissioning ceremonies now routine affairs rather than major events. The Patriot Bay facility alone launched 3 fleet carriers between March and August 1943, while simultaneously producing escort carriers at a rate of 2 per month. Lieutenant Koji Hayashi, a carrier pilot who had survived Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, returned from a reconnaissance flight in May 1943 with a report that his squadron commander initially refused to believe. "I counted 9 American carriers operating within 100 miles of truck," Hayashi insisted, his voice shaking. 9! And these were fleet carriers, not the smaller escort types. They were conducting flight operations simultaneously, hundreds of aircraft in the air. The sky was thick with them.
In June 1943, Japanese intelligence obtained photographs that would be circulated among naval staff with a sense of numb disbelief. The images, taken by a long-range reconnaissance aircraft that never returned, showed the Crater Lake facility in Oregon during peak production. Photo interpreter Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe had analyzed thousands of reconnaissance images during his career. These photographs made him question his own competency. 15 carriers under construction simultaneously, he reported to Admiral Morimoto, at one facility. 3 are within weeks of launch. The others range from 30% to 70% complete. And this is only one of 7 major American carrier production facilities. Morimoto studied the photographs in silence. The images showed an industrial operation that defied Japanese assumptions about shipbuilding. Massive cranes moved prefabricated hull sections into position. Entire flight deck assemblies, complete with elevators and errating gear, waited on specialized rail cars for installation. Engine rooms arrived as complete units, dropped into hulls like engines into automobile chassis. "They're not building these ships," Morimoto said quietly. "They're manufacturing them, like watches, like bicycles." The photographs showed something else equally disturbing: the workforce. Thousands of workers swarmed over each hull, working in coordinated teams. Night photographs showed the facilities blazing with light, construction proceeding around the clock in 3 shifts. Commander Suzuki, studying the technical details, identified the innovation that made it possible. Welded construction throughout, prefabricated compartments, standardized equipment layouts. They've reduced the number of unique components from tens of thousands to a few thousand. Everything is interchangeable, replaceable. A damaged carrier can be repaired using parts from any other carrier in the class. This standardization extended to operational procedures. American carriers all used the same aircraft handling equipment, the same catapults, the same arresting gear. Pilots could transfer between carriers with minimal retraining. Maintenance crews could work on any vessel. Damage control procedures were identical across the fleet. Japan's carriers, by contrast, were each unique, custom-designed vessels that required specialized training and parts. The Kaga's flight deck procedures differed significantly from the Akagi's. Parts couldn't be transferred between vessels. This craftsmanship approach, once a source of pride, now revealed itself as a fatal weakness.
The moment when theoretical projections transformed into undeniable combat reality came on June 19, 1944, during what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Kentaro Shimazaki, now commanding the mobile fleet, had assembled the largest carrier force Japan could muster, 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers carrying 450 aircraft. Intelligence suggested the Americans had committed 3, perhaps 4 carriers to the operation. The actual American force consisted of 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, carrying over 900 aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Masao Yamada, leading a strike force of 40 torpedo bombers toward the American fleet, saw the forest of carriers spread across the ocean and felt his stomach drop. There were too many, he transmitted to his formation. Multiple task groups, I count 8, no 10 carriers visible. This can't be correct. But it was correct, and it was about to get worse. What followed was a slaughter so one-sided that American pilots would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft, flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots, were cut down in waves by American fighters launched from carriers that seemed endless in number. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, commanding the carrier Zukaku, watched from his bridge as American attack waves rolled in continuously. "They're not conducting discrete strikes," he reported frantically to Shimazaki. "They're maintaining constant aerial coverage. As one wave returns to their carriers, another is already launching. It's not a battle, it's systematic destruction." The Japanese lost 645 aircraft and 3 carriers. The Americans lost 123 aircraft and no carriers. But the numbers told only part of the story. The psychological impact of facing such overwhelming force shattered Japanese naval morale permanently. Commander Kenji Watanabe, serving aboard the Shokaku when she was hit by American torpedoes, survived to write in his diary, "We fought with courage, we fought with skill. It didn't matter. There were too many of them, too many carriers, too many aircraft. When we hit one carrier, 2 more appeared. When we sank one, which we never did, they had 10 more. We weren't defeated tactically, we were buried industrially." The reports from Philippine Sea reached Tokyo within hours. Admiral Morimoto, reading the operational summaries in his office, realized he was looking at the death certificate of Japanese naval aviation. 15 carriers, he said to his deputy. They committed 15 carriers to one operation. We barely have 9 operational carriers in our entire Navy, and half of those lack sufficient aircraft or trained pilots. But the true horror lay in the intelligence assessments that followed. The 15 carriers that devastated the Japanese at Philippine Sea represented less than half of American operational carrier strength. More than 20 additional carriers were operating in other Pacific sectors or completing workups before deployment. By August 1944, American carrier strength peaked at 41 fleet and light carriers, plus over 70 escort carriers. Japan possessed 6 operational fleet carriers and 3 light carriers, with no significant new construction due to complete before war's end. The production disparity that Japanese officers had dismissed as impossible in 1941 had become brutally, undeniably real. Rear Admiral Takeshi Kobayashi, one of the few surviving senior officers from the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, was asked by a German naval liaison officer in September 1944 how Japan planned to counter American carrier superiority. Kobayashi's response, recorded in German naval archives, captured the complete psychological collapse. Counter them? With what? They build carriers faster than we can build the aircraft to attack them with. They produce pilots faster than we can train ours. Their shipyards launch more carriers in a month than we can construct in a year. You ask how we counter them? We don't. We simply try to survive them. By late 1944, The statistical reality had become so lopsided that American naval officers struggled to believe their own accounting. From Pearl Harbor to the end of 1944, American shipyards had completed 18 fleet carriers, Essex class, 9 light carriers, Independence class, and 77 escort carriers, various classes. Total, 104 aircraft carriers in 3 years. In the same period, Japan completed 5 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, and 4 escort carriers. Total, 14 aircraft carriers. The ratio was 7.4 to 1, and this didn't account for American construction still in progress. 6 more Essex-class carriers would be completed by August 1945. Commander Ichiro Suzuki, preparing a final assessment of American naval production for the Naval General Staff in December 1944, included a section that his superiors ordered removed as defeatist. The deleted section read, "The Americans have not defeated us through superior tactics or braver sailors. They have defeated us by transforming naval warfare into industrial warfare. They approached carrier construction as an engineering problem to be solved through manufacturing efficiency, not as a craft to be perfected through artisanal skill. Where we built each carrier as a unique masterwork, they built them as standardized products. Where we relied on skilled craftsmen requiring years of training, they created assembly processes that could be performed by workers with weeks of training. Where we maximized individual ship quality, they maximized fleet quantity. The result is that American carrier strength now exceeds our strength by factors that would have seemed like fantasy in 1941. They can lose 5 carriers in a battle and have 10 more arrive within weeks. We cannot lose a single carrier without permanently diminishing our strength because we cannot replace it. This is not a naval war anymore. It is an industrial contest, and we never had a chance."
What Japanese intelligence never fully grasped was the human dimension of American production. The carriers that destroyed Japanese naval power weren't just built by machines. They were built by a workforce that grew from virtually nothing to over 2 million shipyard workers by 1943. Sarah Mitchell had been a school teacher in Oregon before the war. By 1943, she was a lead crane operator at Crater Lake, maneuvering 50-ton hull sections into position with precision measured in inches. She was one of 45,000 women working at the facility. "We knew we were building carriers," Sarah recalled in a 1989 interview, "but we didn't really understand what that meant until we started seeing them in newsreels with hundreds of aircraft on their decks. Then it hit us. We built that. The flight deck I helped install was launching fighters over Japan. The hangar bay I welded was protecting pilots. It made the 12-hour shifts, the 6-day weeks, all worth it." The American workforce achieved production miracles that Japanese planners considered impossible. The escort carrier USS Kasan Bay was built in 8 months. The fleet carrier USS Bonhomme Richard, laid down in February 1943, was commissioned in November 1944, a 21-month construction time that would have required 3 years in any other navy. This wasn't just about speed, it was about scale. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched 27 carriers. That single year's production exceeded Japan's entire carrier construction from 1920 to 1945.
The clearest acknowledgement of Japan's catastrophic miscalculation came from Admiral Kentaro Shimazaki himself in February 1945, during a private meeting with Fleet Admiral Hideaki Yamada. "I laughed at intelligence reports in December 1941 that suggested the Americans might eventually outproduce us," Shimazaki said, his voice hollow. "I called them a paper tiger with vast resources, but no understanding of naval warfare. I was certain their industrial capacity, while impressive, could never be rapidly converted to warship production." He gestured at the latest intelligence summaries showing 43 operational American fleet and light carriers versus Japan's 4. I was catastrophically wrong. The Americans didn't convert their industry to warship production. They transformed it. They approached carriers not as ships, but as products. They built shipyards specifically designed for mass production. They trained workers in weeks instead of years by breaking complex tasks into simple procedures. They standardized everything, making carriers interchangeable like rifle cartridges. But what haunts me most is realizing they started this transformation before Pearl Harbor. While we were celebrating our tactical victory, they were already building the shipyards that would bury us. By the time we realized what they were doing, they had already launched the first carriers. By the time we understood the scale, they had launched dozens. We never fought the American Navy. We fought American industry. And you cannot sink a factory with a torpedo.
In September 1945, after Japan's surrender, American technical teams toured Japanese shipyards. Their reports revealed the impossible position Japan had faced. The Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Japan's premier construction facility, could support 2 fleet carriers under construction simultaneously. It employed 15,000 workers at peak capacity. The facility was optimized for quality and precision, with skilled craftsmen building each component essentially by hand. The Patriot Bay facility in Rhode Island, by contrast, could support 12 fleet carriers simultaneously. It employed 60,000 workers. The facility was optimized for speed and volume, with semi-skilled workers assembling prefabricated components using standardized procedures. A single American shipyard could outproduce Japan's entire naval construction capacity. In 1952, former Fleet Admiral Yamada was interviewed for a historical project documenting Japanese naval operations. When asked about the greatest strategic mistake of the war, his answer was immediate. We completely misunderstood what we were facing. We thought we were fighting the American Navy, a force of ships, sailors, and pilots. We prepared for a naval war, studying tactics and training our forces for decisive battle. What we actually faced was American industrial capitalism applied to warfare. They didn't just build carriers. They built a carrier production system that could generate hulls faster than we could sink them. They didn't just train pilots. They created a pilot production system that graduated more aviators in a month than we could in a year. We brought craftsmanship to a battle that required mass production. We brought careful, precise construction to a contest that rewarded speed and volume. We thought quality would triumph over quantity. What we failed to understand is that the Americans achieved both quality and quantity. I stood on the deck of the Missouri during the surrender ceremony, surrounded by American carriers visible to the horizon. That's when I finally understood. We hadn't lost a war. We'd lost an industrial competition we never knew we'd entered. The carriers around me weren't military victories. They were economic inevitabilities. We laughed at American industrial capacity in 1941, dismissed it as irrelevant to naval warfare. By 1945, American industry had manufactured our complete defeat. The only surprise is that it took them as long as it did. The final accounting of American carrier production told a story of industrial dominance unprecedented in military history. Total American carrier production, 1941-1945. 24 fleet carriers, Essex class. 9 light carriers, Independence class. 122 escort carriers, various classes. Total, 155 aircraft carriers. Total Japanese carrier production, 1941-1945. 5 fleet carriers. 5 light carriers, 5 escort carriers. Total, 15 aircraft carriers. The ratio? 10.3 American carriers for every Japanese carrier. But even these numbers don't capture the full scope of dominance. American carriers were larger, carried more aircraft, incorporated better damage control, and benefited from superior radar and electronics. A single Essex-class carrier carried 90 to 100 aircraft. Japanese fleet carriers averaged 65 to 75. In aircraft production, the disparity was even more extreme. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced approximately 76,000. In pilot training, American programs graduated over 200,000 pilots. Japan trained approximately 40,000. The warriors who attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had poked not just a military force, but an industrial colossus capable of transforming its entire economy into a war machine within months. The carriers that covered Tokyo Bay during the surrender ceremony weren't just ships. They were physical proof that some wars are decided not on battlefields, but in shipyards, not by tactics, but by production capacity, not by courage, but by industrial might. Vice Admiral Kentaro Shimazaki, reflecting on his confident assessment in December 1941, wrote in his private journal in 1946, "We calculated tonnage, studied tactics, analyzed their existing fleet. What we never calculated was their capacity to build an entirely new fleet while fighting a global war. We asked, how many carriers do they have, when we should have asked, how many carriers can they build? The answer buried us under an avalanche of steel. We laughed at their industrial capacity. We stopped laughing when the sky went dark with carrier-launched aircraft, when the horizon filled with more carriers than we thought possible, when we realized they could replace losses faster than we could inflict them. They didn't just build 8 carriers while we built 1. They built 100 carriers, then kept building more. That's not military construction. That's manufacturing supremacy. And you cannot sink a production line." The Empire of Japan had learned, far too late, that in modern industrial warfare, the shipyard is more powerful than the sword.